Good morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My name is Sean Quimby. I am the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections with Penn Libraries and Director of the Kislak Center. I want to thank you for joining us for the 14th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscripts in the Digital Age. This year, we'll be exploring the theme of loss. Most of us here have dedicated our professional lives to preventing it. At some point, or at the same time, we realize that it is inexorable, not just for the ancient manuscripts that we study, but for the bit streams that we create each day. Sure, there's a brand of techno-utopianism that promises that we can now or soon will be able to archive all experience, but at some point, those of us working in cultural heritage must come to accept the inevitability of loss. Over the next 3 days, we will reflect on how it has shaped what we know about the pre-modern world, from chance survivals to regrettable lacunae. But before we do that, I thought I might start off by talking about its opposite, gain. Technology is one way that we seek to both mitigate against loss by digitizing fragile things and to enhance our ability to study them. The Schoenberg Center for Electronic Texts, SETI, at Penn has just marked its 25th anniversary. While most libraries have digitization programs today, that was not true in the mid-1990s. I was an undergraduate just getting used to the Pine email client when SETI was founded. And it's that spirit of innovation that also led to the establishment of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, which has as its mission to bring manuscript culture, modern technology, and people together. Larry Schoenberg's widow, Barbara Brisdell, is not with us this morning, but will be joining us later. Nevertheless, I want to thank her once again for the many gains that SETI and SIMS have made possible for Penn and for the world of manuscript studies. We've lost much to the global pandemic, even as we've gained, or rather refined, the ability to come together online in generative ways. 340 of you registered to participate in this year's symposium, far more than would fit in the pavilion here on Penn's campus. You come from all over the US, as well as the UK, France, Italy, Greece, Iceland, and Jerusalem. We have much to gain by looking at manuscripts through a truly global lens, and technology makes that easier. I'll finish by saying that we owe these gains not only to technology, but to the efforts of human beings. Here at Penn, I'm talking about the SIMS team, including Amy Hutchins, Dot Porter, Nick Herman, and of course, Lynn Ransom, SIMS Curator of Programs. They've worked to organize the program and will be your guides and hosts over the next 3 days. So I want to thank my colleagues. And with that, I'll hand things over to Lynn as we begin the 14th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscripts in the Digital Age. Over to you, Lynn.
Great, thank you, Sean. I can't tell you how delighted we at the Schoenberg Institute are to be welcoming everyone to this year's event. While I see so many familiar faces in the participant list, faces and names, I'm thrilled to be seeing so many new ones that I hope will soon become familiar as we take this opportunity to get to know one another around our shared interest in manuscript studies over the course of the next 3 days. So as Sean said, and as you all know, our topic this year is loss. The past 18 or 19 months have given the world a lot of opportunities to think about loss. Loss can be painful, tragic, and inevitable, but it can also be preventable or treatable if we seek to understand the forces that lead to loss. Somewhat ironically, the idea for this year's topic actually developed before the pandemic became this thing that has bound all of us by loss. Loss of loved ones, loss of contact, loss of in-person events, and loss of global security, among other things. While these losses still weigh heavily on us, our task over these next 3 days is to put aside the weight of our recent experience and to think constructively about loss as it relates to our shared interests in the field of global manuscript studies. I have to give credit to my colleague, friend, and symposium participant, Laura Cleaver, for coming up with the idea to devote an entire symposium to this theme, which she did as we sat around a table in a crowded pub in London in January of 2020 in another life and another world. As you'll hear about on Friday, Laura is leading a team of researchers to trace the networks of the trade of pre-modern manuscripts in Europe and North America from about 1900 to about 1945, an incredibly tumultuous period for the survival of manuscripts and manuscript collections. Economies and authoritarian structures rose and fell, leading, for example, to the rapid dissemination of collections from old aristocratic families and institutions, as the manuscripts in these collections were sucked up by wealthy industrialists in America. There were also the impacts of imperialism, 2 world wars, and the most inhumane atrocities that often led to manuscript collections and other objects of our shared cultural heritage being atomized as if into air, with the pieces getting picked up and further scattered by dealers and collectors, or simply lost forever. So loss and its implications for her team's understanding of the movements of manuscripts at this time has become a dominant theme in their work. Similarly, the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, which is a project that I manage, records the existence of tens of thousands of manuscripts that either no longer exist or are simply lost, either having disappeared into private collections or destroyed, or broken up into fragments tossed into the winds of the rare book market. In many ways, loss is at the heart of what we all do and think about as manuscript scholars and historians. This is not necessarily a bad or a tragic thing. Loss creates opportunities and inspires us to understand how to fix it, to repair it, or to recover physically or digitally the thing that is lost to us. Whether, as we'll hear in the sessions that follow, that is a broken up or mutilated manuscript, an entire collection of manuscripts destroyed by fire, or the loss of knowledge and cultural, religious, or spiritual values and beliefs. Loss affords us the opportunity to explore and confront its causes, to seek out the truths that lie behind it so that we can better understand what came before and perhaps prevent further tangible and intangible loss and trauma in the future. The affordances of loss are therefore what this symposium is about, and what we hope will frame the discussions that come out of this gathering. To this end, we have invited 18 speakers who will each present on some aspect of loss as the concept relates to manuscript studies. Each day treats a different theme. Today's theme is loss in and of manuscripts. Tomorrow, we will be considering recovering and remediating loss. And on Friday, a workshop session presented by the Cultivate Manuscripts team, this is Laura Cleaver's project. We will hear papers that will reflect upon how manuscript evidence can reveal trauma and conflict. Our program will end with Elaine Traharn's keynote address, The Sense and Seduction of Loss, which will interrogate further the concept of loss and our relationship to it. In addition to these papers, our program features asynchronously the work of 9 scholars who have contributed 5-minute videos on the topic of loss in manuscript studies, especially in digital context. The links to the playlist and to the individual videos will be available or are available in the symposium website, and there should be a link to the website chatted if someone can do that for me. And we'll also post the playlist directly in the chat. We will be streaming the videos during each midday break, ending them about 15 minutes before the afternoon session begins, so we can get set up for the next session. We thank everyone who contributed these videos and encourage the rest of you to enjoy them during the breaks or on your own time. Finally, I would also like to offer my thanks to everyone who has made this event possible. First and foremost, and every year, I especially want to thank Barbara Bristol Schoenberg for her unending support and enthusiasm for what SIMS does to ensure Larry Schoenberg's legacy of open data and shared knowledge. As Sean said, she'll be joining us later today and throughout the event. So if you see her name in the participant list, chat her a thanks and a hello. I'm sure she would love to hear from you. I'd also like to acknowledge my deep gratitude to my colleagues at SIMS and Penn Libraries, especially those on this year's planning committee, Jesse Dummer, Dot Porter, Nick Herman, and Doug Emery, as well as our 2020-2021 SIMS graduate student fellow, Matt Aiello, who has tremendously helped to shape the program this year. He will present his research related to trauma and loss on Friday, and I hope you will all have a chance to attend. Thanks also go to our Penn Library's IT support manager, Betsy Deming, who will be following along to make sure that technology does not fail us and that we don't fail the technology. So now, without further ado, let's begin the first session. I'm going to introduce each speaker before their turn, and we will hold questions until all three speakers have presented. So I'm going to ask Joanna, our first speaker, if you want to start getting set up and share your screen, and I'll introduce you. So our first speaker is Joanna Fronska, who comes to us from the Institut de Recherche d'Histoire des Textes, or the IRHT in Paris, where she is primarily responsible for Initial, an online catalog of illuminated manuscripts in public libraries in France. An art historian by training, she has published widely on illuminated manuscripts, especially related to medieval law. Today, she will be speaking on another project at the IRHT to digitally reconstruct the library at Chartres, which was destroyed by fire in 1944. Her paper is titled "The Loss and Survival of Manuscripts from Chartres, A History of the Cathedral Chapter Library." Please join me in welcoming Joanna Fronska. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for this kind introduction. On May 26, 1944, the Library of Chartres, temporarily housed in the City Hall, was accidentally destroyed by an American bomb. Most of its 500 medieval manuscripts either perished in fire or survived in a fragmentary state. None is intact, and their accessibility and usability for research is widely considered as limited, if not inexistent. The destroyed manuscripts mainly came from two libraries: the Cathedral, once famous for its 11th and 12th century schools, and the Benedictine Abbey of Paris-Aubervilliers, particularly rich in patristic works preserved in 9th and 10th century volumes. Their loss is painfully present in the post-war historiography of Chartres. But are they all lost or unusable? In my paper today, I would like to show you how a long-term project at the Institut de Recherche d'Histoire des Textes, aimed at the reconstruction and study of the damaged manuscripts, slowly restores them to the research community. I will first briefly sketch a history and goals of this long process of restoration, and then, to showcase our methodology, I will focus on one particular case, a newly identified manuscript that John of Salisbury, Bishop of Chartres, bequeathed to the Cathedral Library. The rescue work started in the wake of the disaster quite immediately. The burned manuscripts received a conservation treatment at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. When in 1948, they leaves finally detached from compact and semi-carbonized blocks, as the one you can see here, returned to Chartres, a first extensive work on their identification began. Local scholars, and in particular Maurice Ghislain, historian and archivist, and Yves de Laporte, the author of the Catalogue of Illuminated Manuscripts in Chartres, recognized 164 manuscripts. Both scholars had first-hand knowledge of the collection, but they also had at hand a volume 9 of the Catalogue Général of the manuscripts in French public libraries, one of the best in the series, prepared by a team under Henri Aumont direction in 1890. It still remains our first source of reference. The hundreds of thousands of remaining unidentified fragments were stored in nearly 400 packets. They continue to pose a principal challenge to all researchers who have ever. In 2017, we collaborated with the Centre de Recherche sur la Conservation. During this pilot project, different imaging techniques were applied to a selection of documents, representative of different types of alterations. Here you can see a photography under UV light that renders a virtually faint text readable again. Finally, this year, Melania Zanetti of the University of Padua will test a solution of nanocellulose and nanopolymers in order to consolidate burned edges of paper manuscripts currently too fragile to handle or digitize. The core of our activities, however, has been focused on the identification of manuscripts. After over 15 years of field trips to Chartres and countless hours in front of the screen, we have increased the number of securely identified manuscripts from 164 to 305. To give you a fuller picture of the extent of our work, I checked some numbers. A record-breaking manuscript, a 2-volume register of the chapter deliberation, was found in 21 separate packets. Another 2 old manuscripts from the 10th century containing Augustine's Confessions and Hymo's commentary on the epistles were identified in 10 packets each. 28 further manuscripts were scattered among 4 to 8 packets. I didn't even count those divided among just 2 or 3. Needless to say, one packet could have initially contained fragments from up to 4 or even 6 manuscripts. Some of those heterogeneous bundles were digitized. The reconstruction work, therefore, is carried out in the library in Chartres physically and parallelly online. The digitized fragments, both identified and those awaiting identification, are published in the Bibliothèque Virtuelle, so the digital library of Recherche. You can find here 2 types of shelf marks. Numbers correspond to manuscripts. Those preceded by the word lias, meaning packet or bundle, refer to unidentified fragments gathered in individual envelopes, sometimes with letter A, B, C to mark the subdivision. We may not have a first-hand knowledge of the collection of our predecessors, but we have internet and searchable electronic editions. Location of passages found and read, even in tiny fragments, can be now easily verified, and the text can be identified. The path from the identification of the text to the identification of the manuscript is simple when the text is unique. It is not. If not, a recourse to an older literature is necessary in order to reconstruct the state of knowledge on a given manuscript from before 1944. All aspects of codicological description count here. For example, these fragments of the Etymologia of Isidore could have been identified with manuscript 68 and not with another one, manuscript 16, thanks to the remains of its initials in black ink, decorated with the interlace decoration and the consanguinity and affinity diagrams, both features described in the catalogue of the illuminated manuscripts. Dating, format, or script of a manuscript may also be decisive in the process of identification. Several packets contained, for example, fragments of the 9th or 10th century commentary on Daniel by Hieronymus. According to the catalogue, 4 manuscripts included the text, but only one, manuscript 111, was written in long lines. What's more, its more detailed description in Rand's survey of manuscripts written in Tours allowed me to attempt a reconstruction of its format. The top and inner margins were burnt and the leaves shrank from 23 to only 12 centimeters, but in a quite regular way. So I was able to rescale the digital image and draw a line and a shape here in blue of the original page and of its justification. I also analyzed the script and found characteristic abbreviation noted by Rand in his description. Another important help in the identification came, of course, from the old reproductions. Only a handful of manuscripts were microfilmed before the Second World War, including the famous Heptateuchon by Theodoric of Chartres, that included a collection of texts for teaching of the liberal arts. A selection of miniatures was photographed for Yves de la Porte's catalogue of illuminated manuscripts. Here, a reproduction of the missal for the Three Marys Chapel founded by Charles V, for example, was used to identify this little fragment of the crucifixion. A series of reproductions from a digestum inforciatum not only allowed me to identify the manuscript, but also to study its illuminations and attribute them to an Avignon artist, the master of the Liber Visionis Ezechialis. Finally, photographs taken by an American scholar, Lauren Carey McKinney, during his trip to France in 1930s, provide us with valuable visual reference for medical manuscripts that often includes unedited text, very difficult to identify, like this glossarium here. After 15 years of this Benedictine fieldwork, the study of the manuscripts from Chartres can finally go beyond the piecing together of their scattered fragments and reconstructing their contents. More recently, our attention has been directed to the history of Chartran libraries. Our long-term collaborator, Veronika Drescher of the Fragmentarium, has just completed a thesis at the Freiburg University, Switzerland, on the library of Saint-Père-en-Valais. At a much slower pace, I'm working on the history of the Cathedral Chapter Library. Together, we launched a publication of electronic editions of all extant inventories from Chartres. Our work involves a study of the circulation of manuscripts from Chartres in medieval and modern periods, and the search for manuscripts that left Chartres long before the fire. This brings me to the second part of my presentation, in which I would like to show you how we work on the identification and reconstruction of an individual volume, and my work on the reconstruction of the chapter library can be complementary. Upon his death in 1180, John of Salisbury, the famous 12th century intellectual, and from 1176, Bishop of Chartres, bequeathed a large collection of books to his cathedral. The chapter obituary lists 32 titles and a Bible, perhaps in multiple volumes. John's Lactantius was found in Oxford already in the 19th century. And more recently, Patricia Stirnemann identified his own copy of Polycraticus in Soissons. She also pointed at 3 more manuscripts destroyed at Chartres as possible items of the bequest. The obituary includes, however, one enigmatic and, as for now, unidentified text, a Historia Johannis Turonensis. The book was still in the chapter library by the end of the 16th century. As its title appears in the first long surviving list of manuscripts belonging to the cathedral canons. It was not to be found in the subsequent 17th and 18th century catalogues. The list, preserved among the Dupuy papers now at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, was copied by Augustin Dupuy, canon of Chartres and son of the famous book collector Claude Dupuy. I spent 4 long years researching and editing this list and found 6 manuscripts taken from the chapter library and incorporated successively by Claude and his sons, Pierre, Jacques, and Augustin, into the Dupuy collection. For a long time, I was persuaded that John's Historia disappeared in similar circumstances. The missing manuscript was particularly difficult to find because its text has never been identified, and the 2 Chartran sources were its only trace. The author, John of Tours, is otherwise mentioned only in a collection of questiones traditionally attributed to Odo of Soissons, but later associated with Peter Comesta. According to the author of these Questiones, John of Tours, a pupil of Anselm of Lyon, was his teacher. John would have taught in Tours or perhaps in Troyes, where Comesta got his first education, or even in Paris. In her study of John of Salisbury library, Patricia Stirneman speculated that John of Tours would have written a work of history, perhaps a biblical history, foreshadowing the work of Comesta's Historia Scholastica. As you can see perhaps here, the manuscripts is indeed included among other biblical commentaries. Here you have Expositio Librorum, Veteri Testamenti, Tractatus Psalmorum, etc., and the whole list of glossed manuscripts. This list, the 16th century list, followed, in fact, a thematic order of manuscript chained in the 16 lectern of the chapter library erected at the beginning of the 15th century. During the last year lockdown, I was systematically verifying all our photographic documentation. And when I opened the folder of the manuscripts 169, Patricia's incredibly accurate assumption immediately resonated in my mind. The 1890 catalogue describes the main contents of the manuscripts as abrégé de la Bible ou analyse des livres historiaux, the abridged Bible, or an analysis of historical books, and provides a telling subscription, explicit liber historiarum. Unlike the catalogue claims, the manuscript is not 13th century, but 12th century in English. It was later bound with a 14th century incomplete copy of the Speculum Historiale. As I will try to show, its contents, date, origin, and context of production all provide circumstantial evidence for John's ownership. The catalogue entry that I reproduce vaguely here allows a preliminary reconstruction of the contents. The Liber Historiarum is followed by a series of biblical list of biblical patriarchs, judges, kings of Israel, but also kings of France, dukes of Normandy, and emperors, likely extracted from Hugh of St. Victor's Chronicle. They also allow a rough placement in history, sort of for the composition of this text in the reign of Louis VII and Frederick I. Then we find a series of prologues or introitus to biblical books, mostly attributed to Peter Lombard or Peter of Poitiers in Steckmüller's repertorium, with an unknown introitus to Gratian Decretum, and long extracts from the first part of the Summa Decretorum attributed to Gratian's direct pupil, Pauca Palea. They are appended with several questiones on the Decretum, studied and partly edited by Stefan Kuttner in 1937. He attributed them to the School of Bologna, also of the mid-12th century. This reconstruction served me as a framework for the fragments reordering. Almost all leads of the manuscripts of this manuscript are preserved, but some are fragmentary and some crumbled into small pieces. Virtually all are quite badly washed and now difficult to read without the UV light. Luckily, some badly damaged folio at the beginning preserved their foliation. The order of the rest must have been worked out from the text. For the Summa of Pauca Palea, I had Schulte's edition from the 30s, but for the Liber Historiarum, I could only rely on the Bible, the order of which I followed in my reconstruction. In case of several fragments, fragmented leaves, the marginal gloss was my main reference, but the observation of shapes of fragments was also crucial. Nothing makes you more familiar with the text in a manuscript than putting in order its fragments. I have very quickly realized that the text was not just an abridgment of the Bible, but similarly to Peter Comestor's Historia Scholastica, it also incorporated passages from the biblical glosses and commentaries. For example, the page 14 verse includes lengthy passages from Hugh of St. Victor's commentary on Leviticus in the margin. Another passage from the same commentary is placed in the main column of the text at the end of the chapter of Leviticus, while the margins here accommodate Rabban Moore's commentary on Exodus. I did not choose the passages from Hugh of St. Victor without a reason. Since the pioneering research of Beryl Smalley, we know that Hugh's teaching program, as explained in his Didascalicon, with the importance given to Historia and the literal exegesis of the Bible, had an impact on the making of Peter Comestor's Historia Scholastica. My preliminary examination suggests that John of Tours' Liber Historiarum may be placed in the same intellectual current of using Cheney's term, Victorine historical theology, and perhaps directly preceded Comestor's work. The Liber Historiarum and the Historia Scholastica share similar choice of biblical books that expanded a selection of the most important books according to Hugh of St. Victor. Similarities between several rubrics of the two works are perhaps also not accidental, but the final answers must await a further study of the text and its new photography under UV light. Let's then go back to John of Salisbury. His manuscript is not composite, but contains several texts forming a coherent collection. The collection offers a correlation between the Bible and canon law. Gratian and the early Decretalists used the biblical histories to explain doctrinal notions and to propose solutions to apparent discrepancies in canon law. And the first part of the Summa of Palea is particularly rich in such biblical material. The Introitus Decretorum, as we have seen, is placed amongst the prologues to biblical books as an annex to Liber Historiarum. I believe that it perhaps was John himself who put this collection together. As Beryl Smalley and more recently Julie Barrault have shown, the period beginning with John's exile in Reims, when he sort of had to flee England with Becket between 1163 and 70, is marked in his writing by a very frequent use of biblical argumentation, and especially by his use of the Bible in legal argumentation for the benefit of Thomas Becket's cause. This approach culminated in his call for a return to scripture in canon law at the Lateran Council III in 1179, so just before his death. And indeed, the manuscript can be quite precisely dated to this period. As I have mentioned, the manuscript is of an English origin. Look at this characteristic A's that rise above the lower case, but first of all, at its arabesque and penwork initials. Patricia Stirnemann called my attention to the omnipresent motif of the so-called frog spawn, a distinctive pattern of 2 or 3 adjacent semicircles surrounding a dot, which are characteristic for St. Alban's production. We can find similar initials within St. Alban's manuscripts of the group 2. The dates, according to Rodney Thompson's classification, are between 1140s, 1160s, but with later examples also dating from the Abbot Simon's period, so the late 60s, early 80s of the 12th century. Several features suggest that the manuscripts was indeed copied during this later period. The ruling is drawn in lead point, the E caudata is absent, as is the ampersand, which is always replaced here by the Tironian abbreviation. You can see a very close St. Albans hand in these manuscripts from Cambridge. It is dated to the late 80s already. John of Salisbury accompanied Thomas Becket to England from the exile in France in 1170 and remained there after Becket's assassination until his appointment as the Bishop of Chartres at 1176. In this period, he seemed to have entertained quite close contacts with Abbot Simon of St. Albans, another ally of Thomas Becket. They shared judicial duties, and Simon endowed the Abbey library with a copy of John's work, possibly including John's autograph annotation. This is this manuscript from the British Library. John could have used the St. Albans scriptorium as he used that of Canterbury previously to have his Polycraticus written in the 60s. But why was the memory of the authorship of the main text in the manuscripts 169 lost, and all the knowledge about John's ownership of it? A study of the history of the Chartres chapter library brings us some answers. As we have seen, the Historia Magistri Ioanni Turonensis was recorded in the library under its title and as an independent volume by the end of the 16th century. In the last third of the 17th century, a major reorganization of the collection happened in Chartres. A late 17th century plan of the cathedral by André Philibien shows already a rearranged space of the library. I compare it here with the drawing of Martin Lange that shows the state of the library before. So the eastern windows were closed up, and there was this passage to the toilets created, and this alteration created more wall space. Therefore, the canons could have replaced the 15th century lecterns and their chains with tall bookcases. The preamble to the 17th century catalogue says that 4 of them stored manuscripts. A binding campaign was a part of this reorganization. White parchment bindings known from pre-war descriptions or rare survivals likely date from the 17th century. The catalogue also suggests that the binding campaign involved rearrangements of some manuscripts. Several books, mainly those of less important numbers of leaves, were bound together. Having compared the 16th century list with the 17th century catalogues, I counted at least a dozen of such composite volumes. The manuscripts 169, composed of the 12th century manuscript and the extract of the Speculum Historiale, was amongst them. As the 1980 catalogue states, it was bound in a parchment binding. As you can see here, the new catalogue very accurately described its contents. So you have Historia Veteris Testamenti with glosses, then a chronicle with tables, then introductions to the biblical books, and the commentary of Decretum and the excerpta from Vincent de Beauvais. A mention of the author of the Historia Veteris Testamenti was gone, however, probably with the original binding or original flyleaves. The last word on John of Salisbury's own copy of the Liber Historiarum and on John of Tours' text hasn't been sent yet. Once put in order, the volume should now be cleaned and stretched by a book conservator and rephotographed in the UV light in order to restore the hardly visible portions of the text. The case of John's manuscript is perhaps exceptional because of its contents and context, but it is not unique. More importantly, it shows that a more in-depth research on a burned manuscript is still possible, and that all hasn't been lost in Chartres. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for that. It's amazing what you all have been able to recover in this project. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, but just as a reminder, please save those for the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Georgios Boudalis. Georgios is the Senior Book and Paper Conservator at the Museum of Byzantine Culture. Sorry, John, I'm going to ask to, can you unshare your screen? So Georgios, yeah. He's a Senior Book and Paper Conservator at the Museum of Byzantine Culture in Thessaloniki. In addition to numerous articles on bindings, bookmarks, and end bands, he is the author most recently of the Codex and Crafts in Late Antiquity, which was published as part of an exhibition, I think of the same name, at Bard College in 2017-2018. In this text, he considers the development of the codex format in the context of not just the history of bookmaking, but the history of everyday crafts, such as items such as sock making or shoe making, baskets, etc. He's currently finishing a book on end bands found in the book bindings from the Eastern Mediterranean, which aims to provide a historical and technical account of the great variety of techniques used, many of which can be directly linked to fabric making techniques. We are delighted to have him speak today on the archaeology of loss, the repair of Greek codices between Byzantium and modern conservation. Please join me in welcoming Georgios. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Lynn, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everybody attending today. I guess you see my screen now, right? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So, yes, as Lynn said, I will be speaking about the repair of Greek codices and how this has changed between the Byzantine period or early post-Byzantine period and modern conservation today. And I would start with yeah. So I would start with this very simple, but I think very useful for the purpose of my talk, definition of what loss is according to Cambridge Dictionary. So it is the fact that you no longer have something or you have less of something. And obviously, the first option, no longer have something, is where you really have complete losses of books, examples of destruction where you cannot really repair anything or you cannot really recover anything. And of course, I will not be dealing with that because there is not much to say on that. Instead, I will be speaking with those cases where enough survives of a book that can be repaired. And so let's start with defining the major types of loss on books. This has been identified by someone working in the conservation of books like me. I have been working as a book conservator for more than 20 years now. So first of all is the loss of writing substrate, the loss of complete leaves or parts of leaves, what we call normally lacuna. Then we have the loss of writing substrate coherence. So we don't really have missing folios, but we have damaged folios, and mostly I'm referring to torn pages or tears in the folios of a book block. Then, of course, the loss of writing and decoration. We will definitely see examples of all this. And then finally, I think loss of structural coherence is a rather common sort of damage on books. And by loss of structural coherence, I refer to the binding of books and any damage that can happen to that part of the book. And so let's very quickly see each of these different types of losses, mostly focusing on photographs. That's something I always very happy to do, because I tend to believe that we equally understand by looking at things than by listening to things. So these are some examples of Greek codices, Byzantine codices. This is an example of a part of a book, a good part of the book which has been cut out deliberately from the rest of the book block. This is another one. This is a paper manuscript. The previous one was a parchment one. And these are man-made or man-induced losses. So it is the action of man. This habit, which I'm sure we are all familiar, all of us working with manuscript, which somehow are rather painful to look at. It's the deliberate idea of cutting away mostly decorative parts of from a book block, and I suppose collecting them as in a scrapbook or something. This is not a very common phenomenon in Byzantine manuscript, but it's not rare either. And then you have destruction of or losses on books made by some accident. We've seen some terrible and quite telling examples in the previous talk by Joanna, but there are less serious ones like this one. So fire, I suppose some candle or some drop from a candle that dropped onto this parchment manuscript, and it started burning. Thankfully, without really completing its work. Then losses on the substrate of books, so parchment and paper can equally be the result of insect, of animals, and mold or fungi. And this is an example. It's not obviously a manuscript book, but I quite like the photograph because it shows how fungi can develop on an organic substrate, on an organic material. In this case, of course, paper. In this case, paper as well. This is a 16th century, 15th century Byzantine manuscript in terrible condition. First, because it was it was affected by seriously affected by water, and as a result of that, water and humidity, constant humidity and temperature, rather high temperature, mold has evolved, and resulting in this situation where basically paper is becomes so fragile and so weak because it is consumed by fungi that it cannot really hold itself anymore. And although mold is a thing mostly related to paper, it can be also found on parchment. Not as commonly, I think, as on paper, but it really can have equally devastating effects on parchment. This is a close-up of a paper, and this is an idea of what happens to a paper if it is seriously affected by mold. It really becomes like felt. You cannot even touch it. It really disintegrates because of that action of mold. Speaking about biological agents of damage, rodents come very quickly in mind, and images like that are the result of some mice or some rat working in a library. Most of the photographs I'm showing you are from monastic library collections in Greek Orthodox monasteries or monasteries of the Eastern Mediterranean. One thing to remember is that mice do not really eat paper necessarily. What happens is that their lower teeth grow constantly, like our nails, so they really need to work them constantly in order to worn them out, because otherwise they would become they would become impossible to use, really. So a big part of the damage produced by mice is because of that, and also because sometimes mice do cut small pieces of paper or parchment in order to build their nest. And I think this is the case with this 11th century parchment manuscript, where for some reason the mice really didn't, stopped its work before completing it. And this is not an uncommon damage. It's rather common among manuscripts in monastic collections. And of course, the ones we are all mostly familiar with are the damages created by insects, mostly in the stage of larvae, so in a specific stage of the development, of insects, and they basically eat the organic material, so either paper or parchment, mostly paper because it's softer, I suppose. And it really can lead to it can be like most of these damages. It can be really minimal, it can be really isolated, or it can really affect the whole book to the extent that it's not possible to use anymore. And of course, the areas which are mostly affected by insect are the margins, are the outer surfaces of the book, and the spine. Normally, that's the area where insect infestation starts. Now, let's see the next kind of loss, which is the loss of coherence. So basically tears. It's a very common thing still today. There's nothing much to explain about that. And this is not uncommon at all. What I find it's an interesting type of tears is this example, are cases like this example, where because of excessive ruling, in order to create the lines on which the writing would be lying. So you have situations like this where this excessive ruling results in the tear of parchment mostly. And I think in a while we will see a few examples of how people dealt with these damages. Of course, the loss of writing and decoration, and I think the most obvious example in this case is the loss of writing because of acidic ink. I'm sure most of us working with books, or all of us actually, will have come across such a phenomenon at some point. The thing is that the loss of writing due to acidity is not limited to the writing itself, but it actually affects the whole paper and occasionally parchment. Because it basically burns the surface on which the ink, the writing is done. And it really can have, can lead to extreme damage like this one, where both the writing and the substrate are gone, or examples like this. This sort of damage, I have to say, it's not very common in the Byzantine or post-Byzantine context. For some reason, there are examples, of course, but they're mostly in later centuries, so in the post-Byzantine period, after the late 15th century. But damages like that are, I think, very much more common in Western material, probably. And there are, of course, cases where the substrate is still there, but the writing is not, or at least the writing in the ink of the writing. But examples like this are quite interesting in all different ways. Where basically the ink has flaked off the substrate of parchment in this case, probably for different reasons. One of which must have been definitely the high acidity of the ink, as we can suppose from the fact that the surface of the parchment has been worn out, has been eaten out by the ink. And that's an interesting thing, because even if the ink is gone, we can still read the text. And then this is another example of two folios of the same manuscript. The one at the background is in almost perfect condition. I think this is 13th century. The one to the foreground is seriously affected by both mold and by flaked ink. And this is another view of this detail of this manuscript. I think because this manuscript has been rebound sometime in the 20th century, it is possible that this folio, the folio that has been severely affected by mold and by flaking of ink, must have originally been in another position, because it isn't easy to accept that two leaves, one next to the other, would have such a huge difference of the way they have been preserved. And of course, there are examples where the writing is gone because of the action of water, when inks are soluble, and that's not a very common thing, I have to say, but when things are soluble and water is drops on the pages of a manuscript. This is what happens, or this. And again, we've seen examples in the previous talk where actually modern technology, multispectral analysis today can be the answer to for scholars for situations like that. I'm sure, again, verdigris, the oxidation of copper green, which is not an uncommon pigment in medieval manuscripts, can have results like this. Again, copper green can oxidize very severely, burning out or destroying the substrate, in this case parchment, and this is the back side of the same folio. Again, this fact that ink or pigment can create losses on the substrate, and these are two other examples, two initial letters decorated originally with green, with copper green, with verdigris, which again has oxidized severely and consumed the parchment. Another kind of loss of pigments, which is not uncommon at all in Byzantine manuscripts, is the loss of pigments from miniatures. There are definitely examples where decoration and miniatures are perfectly preserved. There are other examples where they are far than well preserved, and this is a rather common feature in Byzantine manuscripts for various reasons. Probably because of the way parchment has been produced and has been coated. But these are situations that are not uncommon in Byzantine manuscripts. So situations where the pigment on miniatures or decorative elements on the manuscript really flake off the substrate, in some cases allowing us to see, to get a glimpse to these underlying drawings. The loss of structural coherence is, I think, does not really need much explanation, is when the binding of a book, where the codex, the structure of the codex is not sound anymore, and that can be can affect mostly the sewing of a codex. This is the single most important element of the structure of a codex. As long as the sewing is sound, the codex function, the book can function as a book. If the sewing is damaged, then all sorts of problems can appear. You have situations like this where folios, just individual folios, are detached somehow from the main structure of the book, but this thing can be much more severe when the whole or most of the sewing structure is damaged, in which case you basically have a number of gatherings rather than a codex. And now let's give a glimpse into historical repair. So how did people in the Byzantine and early post-Byzantine period dealt with these losses of manuscripts? So how did they repair those manuscripts? And I would start by saying that most of the cases where we do have a repair on original manuscripts, these are manuscripts that didn't have severe damage. Okay, so examples like this, which are really obvious. So just pasting a piece of paper or parchment on the missing areas, that's a very obvious thing, and that could be just very localized, so very minimal, or could affect the whole book look, like in this case. And this is the edge of the book, but I think you can really see the difference between the parchment, which is darker, and the paper, which is which comes either as complete folios inserted between the parchment folios, obviously because parts of the text were gone, but also paper used in order to repair or to integrate missing parts of basically all folios. This is an extreme example of a very laborious repair on a book. But in most cases, normally you would find pasted pieces of paper in the affected areas, either in the margins, like in this photograph at the to the left bottom, but also on the text. If the tear was affecting the text, then it is the commonest thing to do would be to paste a strip of paper on that, and then write on that strip of paper the text that has been covered. And this is something that comes again and again when we come across repaired manuscripts, that the affected areas, because the idea of repairing the book was basically to make it possible to use it, to keep using it, and therefore obviously missing parts of the text wouldn't be acceptable. So they would repair the material, the paper or the parchment, and then they would go and put back the text that was either missing, was either destroyed, or was covered by the repair. And in some cases, this repair of the text, I mean, obviously the repair of the paper, but then coming next to that, the repair of the text was done very carefully, as in the example you see here. So someone very carefully made sure that the lines of one letter coincides, of the new letter coincides and continues the line of the letter, of the pre-existing letter of the underlying the new parts. And there are also examples where for one reason or the other, parchment was used instead of paper, and mostly whenever parchment is used often, you find it is a reused parchment coming from manuscript, what we call manuscript waste. And in this case, both these pieces to the left and right were reused parchment palimpsests. Repairing tears on paper and parchment manuscript, one obvious way was what we've seen before, just pasting a piece of paper or parchment on top of the tear, but then or pasting the two pieces together with adhesive, like in this case, animal glue, most likely. But what I find extremely interesting, and this is something I'm really working on at the moment, I mean, doing some more extensive research on that, is the use of stitching in order to repair tears. And this is something not necessarily new. The earliest example I know of comes from one of these papyrus, early Christian papyrus codices. In this specific example, one of the Bodmer papyri dated in the 4th century, where exactly a tear in the papyrus has been repaired with thread. Okay, and again, this is an example of what I've said just before about this damage created by the excessive ruling, and this is a way to repair that with stitching. And this is one of my favorite manuscripts. It's a very important 9th century parchment manuscript from the St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. This has been repaired extensively with a very fine and a very delicate stitching. I mean, even to modern eyes and our modern technology, I was extremely impressed by seeing how thin this thread was, and how thin the needle used must have been also, and how delicately this work has been carried out in many folios of the manuscript. And it is something that really impressed me for all different reasons. I will come back to this at the end. And I mean, this is not a very common technique, but it's not very rare either. So you do occasionally find it on parchment manuscripts. And what I find extremely interesting is to make this paragon between a suture, the stitching of a wound on human body or of living skin, and the stitching on parchment, because consider that parchment is skin as well. It's not living skin, but it's still skin. And also the idea of the book being a body, this symbolism between a book and a body. Also, do remember or do notice that in Greek, for example, the book block is called the body of the book. Okay, so there is some analogy there, or at least I want to see some analogy there. Obviously, stitching works much better in parchment because of the different qualities of the material, but occasionally you do find it used in paper, like in this example. I think mostly because of the lack of other material to do the repair, so probably because of the lack of paper and the lack of adhesive, but also consider that using thread, using stitching, wouldn't require then going back and writing the part of the text that would have been covered by a paper strip. Okay, so that's an extra reason why maybe use stitching to repair tears. And stitching, when speaking about parchment at least, is not something unheard of. Stitching is very much part of the fabrication of parchment, very commonly, especially in lower qualities, when lower qualities of skins were used. So because of the of imperfections of the skin, or because of the stretching of wet parchment, tears could appear at some point, and in order to not throw it away, of course, the people who fabricated parchment would stitch those tears together, and this is again a very rather common thing on parchment manuscript, both West and East, I suppose. Now the question is, who were the people doing these repairs? And as it often happens in the Byzantine culture, you don't, I mean, even scribal notes are not very common. Then rebinding or repair notes are even rarer. But then in the case of the St. Catherine's Monastery Library in the Sinai, I was able to identify a repair and bookbinding workshop active in the monastery between 1620s and the 1650s almost, in a period that abbot in the monastery was Hioasaph, apparently a person who was very fond of books, because he consistently, it seems that under his guidance, a lot of repair work has been done in the monastery. We have the names, uncommonly so, of 7 different people working on the repair of the manuscripts. And there are some notes which I find extremely interesting, not because they give the name and the date for the repair, but also because they describe this idea that some of the books were really damaged and some of the books required really heavy work. So this is the signature of Hioasaph. That's the abbot of the monastery. So he would put his name not just when on the book he repaired, because he was part of that repair campaign that lasted all these years, but he would also put a note mentioning someone else repairing a manuscript, probably because that someone else maybe wasn't able to read and write, because that's another thing, that not all monks were literate, of course. So this is dated 1637, stating that the book was very much damaged. This is another note, 1636. The book was rebound by Sophronius, hero monk, the Cypriot from Cyprus, with much labor, because it was very worn out, the book. And then finally, this one, for which I wasn't able to find out the photograph of the note, but definitely the text is there, and it says that the present was bound by Gerasimos, hero monk, since it was very damaged and dispersed. So you can understand that the binding was damaged there as well. And with great effort, we put it back together and completed it in the year 1632. That's about the past. Now let's see what we do today with all these damaged manuscripts. And this is a manuscript I worked in this last summer, because it needed to go in an exhibition. It's an important 11th century parchment manuscript. I didn't dispound it. I mean, the structure, I consolidated the structure as much as possible. One end of the front end of the manuscript was missing, together with the board. It had suffered a lot of rodent damage, which I repaired with paper, which is normal nowadays. I mean, we normally, in the past, parchment manuscripts were normally repaired with parchment. I mean, in the past, in the 20th century, I mean, But nowadays, most conservators will use paper, which has a number of advantages. This is another example of two pieces of parchment torn and how they have been put together. The repair of tears on parchment manuscripts. Always, all these examples are done with paper. More examples of this idea of repairing torn parchment. Then infills, so repairing missing areas. In this case, much smaller. Again, paper used here and paper used on both sides. So it's a repair that affects both the recto and the verso of the folios. This is again the manuscripts I've just shown you at the beginning. Still another manuscript, in this case affected by mold. The thing is that you cannot really repair a loss when with new paper, when the paper on which the new paper will be adhered is weak. So all this paper here was very much affected by mold and it was very weak. So in order to make it possible to be repaired, a very thin, very thin paper was pasted in these areas here in order to increase the strength of the paper and make it possible to be repaired, like as you see on the right. We've seen this photograph at the beginning, and we will see how this folio ended up after repair. Nowadays, there are machines which can do that work. I mean, all this work has been done by hand, but nowadays there are what we call leaf casting machine, and the whole thing can be done mechanically. I mean, it is a solution for, of course, for big collections, but in small manuscript collections like the one I'm working on, like the museum I work on, or other institutions, there's no need for such a machine, first. And second, I have never used it, to be honest, so I don't know how. And because I haven't used it, I don't feel very safe of putting a manuscript leaf into a machine, but I suppose it is safe, people use it. This is another example of two folios affected mostly by insect. And these are the same folios after repair. Still another bifolio. Look here, these holes which are due to some previous stitching at the spine. The spine was always a very vulnerable area of the book, and often whenever there is a repair, spine is one of the most oftenly encountered areas of repair. This is the same folio after repair. We've seen this book at the beginning. It was a book obviously very seriously affected by mold, water and then mold. And this is the image of the book before repair, and this is after repair. There was obviously, you can tell, it's a huge amount of work, and that's why, you know, I don't know how feasible it is to repair a lot of stuff in that condition, because we either lack the financial means, or we lack the people to do the work. But this is what we do when we can. Consider this is the same edge of the same book. Consider that in this case, the binding, the original binding was not possible to preserve all the book. So a new binding was done, and the original, what's left of the original binding, was preserved with the book in a box. To the left, the folio before conservation, to the right, the same folio after conservation, and consider that this has also been underwent some wet cleaning. You can see the image to the right is not necessarily very different from the one to the left. And this is an example just to say that there are limits in conservation. Conservation cannot do and should not do miracles, to be honest. Also, do notice that the edges, we preserved everything of the previous repairs, not just where the new text was added, but also the repairs at the edges, because we consider that very much part of the history of the book itself. And the same principle, I mean, we definitely try to stabilize everything we have, but whenever possible, we try to keep books as close to their authentic state as much as possible. Okay, so the two images, the left is after repair, the one to the right is before repair. We did repair the missing areas of the paper, but there was no serious reason why try to repair an endbud. And to be honest, it would be possible to do, but I'm not sure the result would be a nice result. One thing, and the second thing, the book didn't really need it, because obviously we should remind that these are all books in special collections. They are not meant to be used, obviously, on a constant basis. They are only books to be used by scholars in a specific context. Now, how has our approach to the repair of books and losses on books changed in time? And these two images can, one thing is that we repair much, or rather we repair much more than people would have repaired in the 15th and the 16th century. So we tend to repair things that in the past would have been considered not worth repairing. And the examples that Joanna showed us in the previous talk, I think, are very telling. I mean, I don't know if someone would end up with so small and so damaged fragments in the 16th century. I don't think they would have kept them unless there was a very specific reason to do that. So the thing is that nowadays we preserve even those very badly damaged fragments, and we try to repair them, or at least try to stabilize them. Of course, we will repair missing areas and losses, but we will not obviously go back and write the missing text, obviously. As I said, examples like this will stay like this. And to be honest, first, technology gives us the tools, in some cases, to be able to recover the missing text, but I also find them in a way beautiful as they are, basically. And this is very quickly an example of how, at least we at the museum where I work, and me personally, approach conservation of codices. The image to the top is how the book arrived to the conservation lab. The image to the bottom is how it went out of the conservation lab. This is a book that was missing more or less half of its folios, so it was not in very good shape. But what survived was this is a 15th century book, so we considered it important to keep everything there without really disturbing the structure. And these are the images of the before and after of conservation of the book, and also the folios. This is the last folio of this manuscript before and after conservation. I don't, because this is a work I've done almost 10 years ago, I'm not sure I would have, because these are the repairs, and because this book went on display and we wanted this image to be on display, discussing with the curators, we thought that it would be better to make those new paper bring them closer to the tone of to the color of the original paper. I'm not sure I would have done that today, to be honest. Next question is, how have old repairs performed in time, and how have modern ones? And again, the example of that manuscript from the Sinai, of which I'm very fond of. It is surprising to me that this very thin thread and this very rather radical repair or conservation of that manuscript has performed extremely well. I mean, all the pieces are still there. Of course, the thread is not very well preserved in all examples, but everything is more or less there. This is a bifolio from the same manuscript, and these are patches, labels, unused labels, which have been pasted at some point in order to try and keep the whole thing together. Now, this is a 15th century, a very important manuscript. It's Codex Unicus, a very important one that has been repaired in the early 70s, 1970, with the methods and materials that at the time I'm sure were considered to be good ones. They proved to be not good ones at all. The paper has oxidized to this effect, and the adhesive used is not reversible anymore. So the image to the left is the repair of an insect damage with paper pulp and with an adhesive that cannot be reversed nowadays. And the image to the right is the image after the repair. It was possible to take out the paper pulp just by scraping it, but the adhesive is still there. The other thing I want to say is that today we wouldn't probably repair such a thin insect damage, because it is, yes, it is a damage, it's a loss, it's an area of loss, but it's stable, and it's not really, it's not a risk for the paper anymore, as long as, of course, this is used, as I said, in specific context and in a specific way by basically scholars. And I will end up with these rather rhetoric questions. Do old methods have anything to teach us? I would think my understanding is that we have to consider that sometimes less is more. All very heavy repairs that were very fashionable in the past decades, so in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, I don't think are proved to be good for the books anymore. And I think that sometimes very simple repairs or very simple interventions like just a loop of thread is enough to keep things together, or prove to be enough to keep things together. And the last thing, of course, I'm not saying we would go now and stitch together the parchment of old manuscripts. That in today's standards seems to be really excessive, although you know, it's something we should probably consider and think about, and maybe something comes out of that, because
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do need to be aware of time.
Yes, I'm finishing. So I mean that there is elegance in that kind of repair, and that's a thing. And the last thing I need to say is that it's not just the intervention; it's also the quality of materials, and this is very much something you know, conservators today we're all very much aware of, because sometimes materials used prove to be to create more problems than the ones they are supposed to solve. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at the end.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. There's a lot of questions already appearing in the chat that we'll get to at the end of the session. I think many of us were struck by the analogy between the book and the body, which might explain some of the horror that we feel at looking at. I was
struck as well. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much. And if you could stop sharing your screen, we'll move to our third speaker. So our third speaker is Kate Crosby. She is Professor of Buddhist Studies at King's College London. Prior to this position, let me just do one quick thing to remove the spotlight. Prior to this position, she was Director of the Center of Buddhist Studies and Seiyu Kiriyama Reader in Buddhist Studies at the School of Oriental Studies at the University of London. She has held numerous other posts at the Universities of Edinburgh, Lancaster and Cardiff, Oxford University, Dunkirk University in Seoul, and the Buddhist Institute in Phnom Penh. Her research focuses on the history of the relationship between Buddhism and other technologies and how varying responses to modernity influence the shape of rhetoric and practice of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. She has most recently published the monograph Esoteric Theravada, the story of the forgotten meditation tradition of Southeast Asia, which was published last year by Shambhala Publications. We are delighted to have her speak today on an extension of that work in her talk, Stemming the Disappearing Dharma, Manuscripts, Printing, and Meditation in Colonial Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Kate. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so I'm not a conservator, I should just own up, and but I work with manuscripts, and sometimes we try to do, I'm normally working with manuscripts from Buddhist temples. Sometimes they're in national collections like the British Library. So in temples, I'm often involved in kind of ad hoc conservation. And so what I'm really talking about today, apologies by the way if I'm kind of backlit, so it's already got dark here in the UK. So what I wanted to look at today is a bit about the loss of manuscripts, but also what it means for our understanding of Buddhism. And I think I'm probably the only Buddhism person, as it were, in today's sessions. So I thought I'd just give a little background, first of all, of what we can see. So in the modern period, we have Buddhism divided into three broad camps that you can see on the map there. And their ideas of how you gain enlightenment and how you help people are different. So their texts they use are different, but also their technology for preserving texts varies. So in East Asia, we have obviously very early use of printing for, so to reproduce and preserve a Buddhist text is a very meritorious action. And that influence the development, the early development of printing in East Asia. So both Taoist and Buddhist religious ideals contributed to the development of printing, which then obviously spread through Central Asia into Europe. Also in Central Asia, so places like Tibet, Nepal, Mongolia, the use of woodblock printing started relatively early. And because of the climate, these two countries also preserve these two regions preserve relatively early texts. So we have an amazing array of texts from Central Asia, from the manuscripts from the 2nd century onwards. But the area I'm working on is the Theravada region here. So that's Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia. The printing wasn't used until the colonial period. Rather, they relied on manuscripts, and manuscripts don't survive particularly well in this region because of heat and drying out. And also there's, as I'll show, the means of reproducing them is not that expensive. And so if an early manuscript would be a 16th century manuscript. But that also means that we can't really trace the history of the religion very well before the existence of these manuscripts. So there's sort of a big gap in our knowledge of what's going on. Just a little close up there of the region, the part of the world I'm looking at. And that region kind of correlates, so those three regions correlate to what the Buddhist canon looks like. And the area I'm looking at is got the earliest canon, and it's really starts in the 5th century before the Common Era, and probably ends sort of 2nd century before the Common Era, and then you get additions from commentaries and things like that, and then it kind of stops developing. And so now Theravada, the region I'm looking on, it identifies with this early canon and thinks that's the most authoritative text. And so even though it keeps developing within India and then beyond, it tends to identify itself as being the most pure. It's got the only complete canon in an Indic language, whereas Mahayana Buddhism that you find mainly in East Asia, they add additional texts later on, and that's quite an accepted thing to do. So have a much bigger canon. And then the Vajrayana that you get in Central Asia, they add new canonical texts and also an entire body of ritual texts, which they attribute to Buddhas that existed before or in parallel realms to our historical Buddha. So Theravada then has this idea that it is the preserver of the purest form of Buddhism, and that has implications for what I'm going to talk about today about manuscripts and what texts are accepted as valid. And so this is how the canon is made up. It's got these three sections: monastic regulations, teachings by the Buddha, and then this topic called Abhidhamma, which is regarded by non-Theravada Buddhists as being later, but is regarded by Theravada Buddhists as being the teaching of the Buddha. and it's really about causality and very technical and dry. Okay, what do manuscripts in this region look like? So these are a few collections I've been working on. We were cataloguing and cleaning and trying to put back dispersed collections into where they belonged in a particular meditation part of a temple in this case. And just to say that they contain, so we've got that canon on the one hand, but we also have developed traditions with lots of teachings that come later, but they're not considered canon, unlike in other forms of Buddhism, and they tend to be in a mixture of languages. So in Theravada, Pali is the sacred language attributed to the Buddha, and then what tended to happen is the Pali vocabulary tends to be used in texts amidst a vernacular text. So you get a few Pali words and then a vernacular, and some of those vernaculars are still used and some are lost. These are the kind of the ways manuscripts look. So the bottom left hand there, this is the more traditional technology based on, so started in India, and it's palm leaf manuscript. And in these texts, so the plants used are grown quite commonly. Some of them are, so it would be traditional to have one in, temple, this kind of thing is quite accessible. And you carve into the manuscript. The scripts used tend to be round so that you don't cut along the natural lines in the manuscript. So they, just like we saw in the last paper where they the drawing of lines cause these splits in the manuscript. If you just drew a straight line on here as part of a letter, it would probably split the manuscript. So round writing, inscribing, and then rub soot into it. The other images you can see are of folding, so leporello style manuscripts. They're made of another type of plant, a kind of different types of the mulberry genus, and they are so a kind of paper, so it's a type of paper, and they're able to make them much bigger, so you tend to be able to have illustrations like medical illustrations in them. So these are all time manuscripts. So in Southeast Asia, you tend to have a lot of the paper manuscripts, and the palm leaf may be used for more ritual texts maybe, whereas in Sri Lanka, you just have the palm leaf ones. Okay, so that's my little overview about the manuscripts. And now I want to move on to talk about what happened in the 19th century as a result of colonialism. So there's a prediction in Buddhist canonical and commentarial texts that the Buddhism is called the Sasana, means the teaching of Buddhism. So particularly the Buddha's truth, the Dharma, will decline, and when it declines, all sorts of awful things will happen. Warfare, we'll start killing each other, disease, lifespans will become shorter, and that kind of thing. So a kind of apocalyptic vision of what will happen at the end of the Buddha's teaching. And then what happens is that you can't gain enlightenment, and you have to try and do meritorious works to be reborn in the presence of a future Buddha. Now, this is distinctive to Theravada. There's also this prediction and fear in other forms of Buddhism, but they may believe that another Buddha is out there. So we have this anxiety in Japan, for example, in the 13th century, that the Dharma is coming to an end. And because they believe that there's another Buddha out there in a Pure Land, you get the rise of Pure Land Buddhism, where you devote yourself to that Buddha and get reborn there. But in Theravada, only one Buddha at a time. So they were very anxious about gaining enlightenment or trying to stop the Dharma from disappearing in the current moment. So just a bit on the left hand side, you've got a fear of decline. What's causing it at this point, other than the prediction that it will happen? You've got the Portuguese, Dutch, and British, and then French, occupying, taking over parts of the Theravada world from the 16th century onwards. And particularly in the 19th century, this develops further, and you have throughout the 19th century the Anglo-Burmese wars, which lead to the loss of Burma. And they are marked by looting, warfare, and disease, including the mass movement of peoples to farm or run the new monocultures, or run the the administration of the colonies. And so people were very afraid. This is a quotation from a Russian observer, Minaev. He's an Orientalist, and he writes in 1886, "The Burmese are afraid of the annihilation of their faith, the fate of Buddhism." And the one of the features of that is the disruption and disease and destruction causes a loss of access to the spiritual path and to markers of Buddhism. So things like the looting of images. Images are created, Buddha images are created to preserve the Dharma, to act as reminders and protectors of the teaching, for example. And also texts get looted and taken away. So there's a fear that those canonical texts, especially all texts, but canonical texts, will disappear. And they disappear in the reverse order. So that Abhidhamma, that causality, text about causality, the very technical stuff, is going to disappear first. And then on the right-hand side of your slide there, you can see some of the responses. So the first response I've mentioned is that they use Buddhism to both combat colonialism and to centralize the state, and I'll explain how. So it depends on which country we're talking about, but in Burma and in Sri Lanka, so the British had a policy of non-intervention into religion, whereas Buddhism had been, and its preservation, in fact all religions, had been the responsibility of the king before the British. And the British being unwilling to be involved in religious affairs meant that initially this was seen as a problem, but then it meant people realized that if you do something that's religious, then the government, the colonial government, is not going to pay any attention to it. And so you have religion as a marker of resistance. And this includes such things as, so one of the biggest events in Burmese resistance to the British was the Great Shoe Debate, where the walking on sacred sites with shoes was challenged as a disrespect to religion. And this of course challenged the decorum and authority of the British. So so you see this development then of taking what are essentially religious beliefs and religious practices, taking those as possible sites of challenge. And the other thing I've mentioned there is the centralization of the state, and that's going to be one of the most relevant things for us. So in Thailand remained independent pretty much. It ceded some territory to France and British, who are sort of taking Burma and Laos and Cambodia on either side of Thailand. And how they organized themselves to resist is they used Buddhism, because Buddhism was really the only organization present at every level of society, from the village to the central capital. And they started changing how it was organized. So whereas you had local traditions, they began insisting on people rising through the ecclesiastical ranks through their reception of education at the centre and awards from the centre. And I'll come back to that shortly. Other responses to the fear of the decline. So people tried to undertake meritorious actions like sponsoring Buddhist institutions and buildings. And next one's really important, revising and reproducing texts. This is called a council, emphasizing the canon, the early canon, and began also to use print technology. So from the 1830s, we find Buddhists taking over the printing press from usually from missionaries, and using that technology to combat missionary work. And we'll see how it gets used in shortly. Other responses were to try and enhance practice, especially meditation, and to develop fast tracks to enlightenment now, rather than think it was okay to earn merit for a better life in the next rebirth, so that all Buddhists believing in samsara, the round of death and rebirth. And in Burma, we find that there was a huge emphasis on learning Abhidhamma, the really technical text about causality, whereas in Thailand we have the rejection of Abhidhamma as a later development. So now I want to look at some of these, what this meant in terms of texts. So here's one response. So this is, just to explain these images. So this is in the 19th century. So, and we've already got the fear of the decline because of the British. They haven't yet completely taken over Burma. And so one of the last kings, he orders the inscription of the entire Buddhist canon, which is vast, onto marble slabs. And so the bottom right hand corner, you've got what the inscription looks. They're all on these stones, these slabs, and then each one is housed in a little shrine, and then each shrine is collected in a group, and this is the whole site. So this is response in Burma, which then the British take over. So I just want to, and one of the things I should say here is this is actually quite an unusual treatment of text. So these shrines here would normally contain relics of the Buddha's body or an image. So in one of the reasons we have earlier manuscripts from other regions, other areas of Buddhism, is that equation between the body of the Buddha and the body of teachings. So that equation means that when images are made in Central Asia, or particularly in Central Asia, also to some extent in East Asia, the images may be packed with manuscripts. And so these survive much longer, whereas that practice was not used in Theravada. You might get a few lines of inscription, but not manuscripts being packed into these images. So this is a very unusual use, and it paves the way for the printing of manuscripts, which I'll come on to next. But I just want to talk a little bit about Thailand. So Thailand is the country that manages to remain independent. It's a kind of pretty much constant negotiation until the First World War. And what they do, so I've got pictures of two of these kings in their Chinese style and Thai style regalia, but you also get images of them in Western costume as well, because they are basically kind of drawing on Chinese, Thai and Western traditions to try and make a centralized state which is robust against loss of sovereignty. And one of the ways they do this is that they insist on regional Buddhist teachers using Pali and having this central education, and they ban the teaching of regional teaching, and they insist that if a monk preaches, he has to use either Pali or Bangkok Thai. So what we now think of as the language Thai is just one of these regional dialects. And monks rely on the food given to them by lay supporters, and it becomes illegal for a while to feed monks if they are using a regional language rather than Pali or Bangkok Thai. The other thing they do is they take regional manuscripts out and they burn them publicly, and they collect these. In fact, that was very public, and what wasn't known is that they were collecting a lot of them, and these were actually taken into royal libraries in Bangkok, which became part of the National Archives in Bangkok. But the extent of the collections in Bangkok only came out within the past 10 years. So it was thought that many of these things had been destroyed. The reason they probably collected them rather than destroyed them is this equation of the Dharma with both the body of the Buddha and with power. So manuscripts are housed in temples not just for their contents, but because they are the presence of the Buddha's teaching, and they are a source of protective power as well. Just as an aside, medicine also changed radically in this period, with the kind of adopting and collaboration with Western medics. Eventually there was a period of competition, and this has, because some of the traditional knowledge I'm going to talk about in relation to meditation also had medical applications, this undermined the income of people preserving traditional manuscripts and traditional knowledge. As part of their, so this is, we start then in the 19th century getting the printing of the Pali canon, so the Theravada Buddhist canon. In the late 19th century, the first one is actually Siam, Thailand, and they distribute it around the country. So you have to start learning Pali and the canon rather than the knowledge and that's been handed down locally in local languages. And so that's actually quite a bit earlier than the completion is much earlier than the British Pali Text Society text, although that started earlier. And in Burma, you have the celebration of independence, which is also the midway in that's 2,500 years after the death of the Buddha. You have a printing as well, and that's actually used as a basis of heresy trials in Burma. So things that aren't in the canon can be deemed unorthodox, and during the military period, so after 1962, these become the basis of heresy trials and imprisoning people or forcing them to disrobe on the basis of not teaching what's in the canon. Right, I now want to talk a little bit about meditation, because meditation also changes in this period, and this then affects the combination of what happens with manuscripts, and the changes in meditation affect how we understand Buddhist meditation, Buddhist-derived meditation such as mindfulness, and Buddhism as a whole today. Okay, so we're probably all familiar with the term mindfulness. It's a Buddhist-derived meditation that derives in part from Zen practice, but also from what's called Vipassana, which is a type of meditation that develops in the 19th century and early 20th century in Burma in response to the fear that the Dharma is going to disappear because of British colonialism. And the monk you've got there in the image is a very famous monk called Lady Sayadaw, who he was actually close to political power. He was very, very learned, very well respected, but also learned from those interested in westernization, and so was a very clear communicator. But when his monastery is burnt down, he ends up withdrawing into this area that's well known for meditation. And he's one of the very influential monks in an adaptation of meditation. And I'll just run through this now. So basically, monks attempt to revive and protect Buddhist teachings, and one of those things they try and do is fast tracks to nirvana now. So before it completely disappears, we've got to become enlightened now. And and also everybody should try and do it. So before we might think it was the role of monks or people who were elderly to meditate, but now everybody's got to do it. And this leads to sort of public visible organizations dedicated to this practice. And we also get a shift to meditation as a mind science, and the somatic side is marginalized. So I'll come back to the somatic side shortly, but the benefit of this is, so this is now an activity that's resisting colonialism, but it's within the area of religion. So it's not the subject of colonial scrutiny, but it is also above the colonial dominance of the physical realm. And so the physical aspects of meditation are left to one side, and this circumvents the kind of colonial Cartesian mind-body divide, which underlines colonial science at that point. Okay, so Lady Sywell then is both a modernizer and a traditionist, and the meditation he develops, because it can be done anywhere in short bursts, and it's focusing on understanding Buddhist teachings of like impermanence and no self, it's already packaged to export to urban and later the secular realm. And so ironically, it's this quest to get enlightenment as soon as you can before the Dharma disappears that leads to a type of meditation that can be used in a non-religious way, in a secular way. We've got then this change in meditation at the same time as the active destruction and the loss of manuscripts, so manuscripts in regional languages not being used. And I just want to add, so we've heard about damage by rats, insects, damp, drying out, etc., especially in this region, drying out, and they basically turn to powder. But another thing is, I've mentioned that manuscripts are powerful. They contain powerful words. And so one way of dealing with them is to make amulets out of them. So these amulets are powerful tokens. Now, in the past, historically, the manuscript would have been copied, a new text, cheap technology, a new text be copied, and then the old text that was getting brittle would be reused as amulets. But with changes in expectations of what's most important, i.e. the early canon, and what meditation should look like, it means that the manuscripts are no longer copied. Also, we have these centrally printed canons. So the text on the left, by the way, it's just a central piece of a meditation manuscript, and it's showing where you physically place things that you've developed in meditation. So in your mind, you physically place them in the body. And I want to talk a bit about, let's just check how I'm doing for time.
If we have a couple more minutes.
Okay,
right.
So I'm just going to quickly say, so Buddhism is about, Buddhist meditation is about self-transformation, but there are two types of problem that you're trying to get rid of. One is these temporary hindrances, things like anxiety, I've mentioned here. And what we find is global Buddhist drive meditation is tackling these. So it's but traditional meditation is interested in uprooting things that keep us going in samsara, life after life. And so they're more interested in changing. These are sort of the lower end of meditation that we're using in global Buddhism, and they're interested in more advanced practices that can change your embodied experiences. And I'll just briefly, and so actually meditation is quite somatic, and you bring experiences. So there isn't this body mind divide. You bring meditation experiences into the body when you're doing these meditations. Just as an aside, these are cave temples from the 18th century, where the manuscripts I'm working on from Sri Lanka come from. So I'm very lucky that the Sri Lankan monks were learning from time masters, so recorded in detail the practices they were doing. Now, in the modern period, we've got this sidelining of these physical practices. They're dismissed by the reformist kings of Thailand, who are hugely influential because they're not in the early canon. And what they do is these practices develop in parallel with other scientific developments in medicine, chemistry, generative grammar, hydrology. I could go into that in the questions, but it's just basically they're interested in transformation. So they are working in parallel with other technologies of how you bring about change in a physical substance. So we've mentioned already they're de-emphasized in the modern period, and although modernized versions have survived, we've got the loss of the expertise of the higher level in the physical practices. This is a late friend of mine who risked his life to try and save these texts of these meditation practices, because where places were modernized, so in Thailand and Phnom Penh, we lost these techniques because they were parallel with traditional sciences that are displaced by colonialism and all these other changes I've mentioned. Where in rural Laos and Cambodia, not so centralized, they survived into the 1970s, but then the Marxist revolutions really destroyed the last strongholds. And my final slide here. So what has this got to do with Angelina Jolie's back, which is the image you can see? So that tattoo that she has there is, you can copy them out of printed books now, but traditionally it was the meditation master who developed these tattoos with the types of physical practices that create an empowered body, and all these different ways of placing letters. These are empowered letters, and the movements are based on the movements used in the meditation practices. So, but in the modern period, meditation is no longer about physical power, it's just mind science. And we get a demotion of this body power technology to being a kind of magical practice. So we have this emphasis on meditation as being mind science, and Buddhism is really associated with those. But its contribution to physical sciences, things like hydrology, medicine, tends to be forgotten. And as manuscripts and expertise disappear, we've really lost an entire culture and technology of how to do these practices. And I just want to say that much of the important research in this area is actually done by practitioners of one particular group, and they've been motivated by accusations that their practices, which are a modernized version of these somatic practices, are unorthodox. I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Sort of a slightly disconcerting image of Angelina Jolie's back, but I love that it's a manuscript, I guess, of some form. All right, so I think we can open the floor to questions. There are quite a few questions already in the chat, and I'm going to try to distribute them among speakers. But I'll start by asking Georgios to maybe to address Roger Wick's question about, he would like to hear more about the mechanical repair of the folios of the manuscripts. And I'm also looking out for raised hands.
Of manuscripts in general, or of a specific manuscript? I'm not.
I think you mentioned that. I think he just doesn't know about the process of how one.
Because mechanical damage, any mechanical repair, any repair which basically is addressing the material, the substrate of writing, is a mechanical repair. So anything that is referring to the material of the book is a mechanical repair. I'm not sure I can. So the repair with the paper repairs on a manuscript, either paper or parchment, is in a way it's a mechanical repair, because it improves the mechanical stability and the integrity of the manuscript. Does that say something?
Roger, I think you could unmute yourself if you want to pursue it further. Otherwise, we can.
Oh, I see. No, it is obviously the repair done by hand. Yeah, no, yes. Well, yes, sorry about that. You're right. Yeah, like in the same way we say mechanical damage on a book is a damage that refers to mechanical parts of the book. So the sewing is a mechanical part of the book, even if it's not a machine, obviously, but it works in mechanical terms. And so any damage there is a mechanical damage. So in that sense, when we speak about mechanical repair, is a repair which refers to the material of the book, not the intellectual or artistic aspects, etc. Yeah.
Thank you for the explanation. I was confused by the adjective
Right, yes.
mechanical. Somehow I thought you had invented a machine that could do this.
No, I wish I had. No, I haven't.
Thank you very much. I think if I may, I'd like to ask just a quick question to Kate. And I was curious about what you said, the motivations to conserve or the manuscripts are sort of coming out of accusations of unorthodoxy. And I'm just wondering how this is being, is there sort of an organization principle behind this, or are people just sort of doing this kind of ad hoc, I guess, if that makes any sense?
So when I started working on these manuscripts and so meditation manuscripts, essentially, oh gosh, 30 years ago, they seemed completely incomprehensible to me. And so it was a great, PhD topic, because what did these things mean? People thought they were nonsense. And it took a long time to work out. They were about this transformation described in Abhidhamma, these texts. And I thought I'd hit on the most obscure topic in the world. And then in Thailand, there's a modern movement called Dhammakaya movement, and they're pretty powerful and a lot of wealthy donors. So they acquired quite a lot of land, property, and influence, and they were aligned at one point with Prime Minister Thaksin. And so the opponents of Thaksin and of this temple began to accuse them of doing a meditation that was not orthodox. And it's basically is orthodox, but it's not there in the canon because it develops alongside other sciences. And so this led to, in fact, I didn't know it was happening at the time, but somebody who was an undergraduate with me, a Buddhist monk in Oxford, he started doing his research in order to try and look into the background and try and document the history of their tradition to prove that this was a valid form of Buddhism.
Interesting. Thanks. I think, sorry, moving on. There's lots in the chat, and I want to make sure I'm doing this in order. Okay, so Mary Allen Johnson has a question for Georgios. Thanks so much for the presentation, fascinating presentation. Would you comment on the best way to protect the manuscripts against loss depending on the environment? For example, St. Catherine's versus Mount Athos in terms of how the codices are housed. And I think this could probably also apply to other speakers in this session. But Georgios, I'll let you take that.
I wonder if that question refers to the difference in climate between one monastery and the other, and how that affects the proper conservation or the proper housing. Is that what is meant?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, well, in both monasteries, one is very arid. Sinai has, I think the mean value of humidity is 18% throughout the year, which is extremely low. It is so low that we would think it's damaging the books. It's not damaging the books. On the other hand, Mount Athos is surrounded by the sea. It's mountainous, full of vegetation, etc. So these are completely different things. Nevertheless, in both cases, books are housed ideally, not all of them, but the idea is to house all the books in boxes. And second thing is that in the Sinai, I don't think there is even installed air conditioning, while in Mount Athos, most monasteries will have air conditioning in their libraries. The thing with the Sinai is that despite the fact that temperature is more or less stable and humidity is more or less again stable. So even if the conditions are not ideal according to what we know from the bibliography on the subject, there is very little variation throughout the year. And therefore, everyone, I think, agreed that there is no point changing that. The manuscripts have been preserved there for hundreds of years, and they are we all think in good condition for what they are and how they have been preserved. And I think that will not change. Yeah. Does that answer your question somehow?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Nick Herman has a question for Joanna. I was interested in the discovery of the McKinney photographs of the Chartres manuscripts at Chapel Hill. And so he asked, what do you think is the likelihood that we will find further pre-war photos, notes, et cetera, regarding the library and other archives?
I hope there is a chance of finding more. And we know of some that are sort of missing. There were microfilms done by Stefan Kuttner that were supposed to be in Munich, but we can't find them. I mean, the library can't find 2 microfilms of legal manuscripts from Chartres. We are sort of finding those things sometimes when collections are put online. And we recently found more photos in the Warburg Institute from one of the manuscripts. And those that I showed you from this digest, there was a whole collection of all illuminated initials that we found by accident because the archives from Chartres, the departmental archives, put them online, but they were not catalogued as manuscripts photos. But I don't remember what was the tag, but it was completely disconnected. It was among pictures of the cathedral. So I hope that there are others somewhere still, and we are sort of trying to find them. So if you ever come across any pictures from Chartres, please let us know.